Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome. What is that? One of the primary things that goes wrong is that the imbalance in hormones leads to an excess of the male type of hormones. So as women, we are meant to have some male hormones, but not an overwhelming amount of male hormones. What happens in PCOS is that you have excess in male hormones, and that leads to a few symptoms. So what are some of the symptoms of polycystic ovarian syndrome? They include things like a male pattern of hair growth. Now, this is probably one of the most troubling symptoms that affects women with PCOS, is the fact that they start to grow hair in places where they shouldn't be growing hair. So the hair starts to grow on the mustache area, the chin area, so women start growing a beard, and then sometimes also even on the lower abdomen, sometimes excess hair on the arms, and even around the nipples, some women can experience, or on the chest, women can experience hair growth in those areas. But it's not only the pattern of male hair growth, so they get women get hair in places where they don't want to have hair, but it also is very coarse. So it's a male type of hair as well. So it's very thick and very coarse, and so that's probably one of the main reasons why women come in to see a doctor, is because they get this overwhelming amount of hair growth, and it becomes difficult to keep it on top of things like waxing and removing the hair and trying to conceal. I have women who would say to me, my husband doesn't know that I actually have a beard because I'm constantly like plucking the hair out or waxing or even getting laser removal. Another thing that happens, and that term, if anybody, in case people want to know what that's called, that term is called hirsutism. So that's the medical term. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it, but hirsutism is the medical term that we use to describe a male type of hair growth in women. So in polycystic ovarian syndrome, what happens is that because there's male dominant hormones, what's supposed to be happening in your female cycle, in your reproductive cycle, doesn't happen. And so one of the other troubling symptoms of polycystic ovarian syndrome is that a lot of women either have no period, or they have a very light period that is with long cycles. So for example, we expect a woman, and this is really, the more I learn about women's hormones, the more I realize that what we previously thought was a normal woman's cycle, so 28 days, is actually not 100% accurate. But typically we would expect a woman's cycle to vary from anywhere between about 26 to about 35 days. But what happens with polycystic ovarian syndrome is that because you have lots of male hormones and you're not producing enough of the female hormones, your period actually doesn't come as often as it's supposed to. So you get women who don't menstruate at all. You get women who will have long gaps between their menstruation. So often we say that if the period's occurring less than 9 times a year, then that's suspicious for what we call anovulation, which means that you're not actually ovulating, you're not producing the egg every month that gets released during the period. So the cycles tend to be longer, and they also tend to be a lower flow. So women with PCOS generally tend to have less bleeding for a shorter period of time, and then a long period of time between the actual periods. So if you are not ovulating as a woman, you can appreciate that you are going to have problems conceiving. You're going to have a problem having children, because you need the egg to be able to be fertilized to make the baby, right? So a lot of women with PCOS will struggle with fertility issues as well. Acne is another one that can sometimes happen because of the androgen excess. So acne is, and commonly it's hormonal acne. So around the chin area, women will complain of really coarse acne around the chin area as well. The other interesting thing about polycystic ovarian syndrome is that often they are also experiencing something called insulin resistance. Now that is a buzzword, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about insulin resistance. You've heard that perhaps you get insulin resistance before you actually get diabetes. And so what we find is that a lot of women have insulin resistance as well, and it's part of how we make the diagnosis of PCOS. Now, what happens in insulin resistance, or what insulin resistance is it's an excess of insulin in your bloodstream. Insulin is another hormone. It's not a sex hormone, but it's another type of hormone. And what insulin does is, I like to describe it as insulin unlocks the cell. So if you think of your cell needs energy, it needs glucose. Or another type of energy, but usually we refer to insulin as opening the cell door, like a key in the lock that opens the door, that allows glucose to leave the bloodstream and go into the cell, where it needs to give the cell energy so that it can perform its functions. What happens in insulin resistance is that instead of the insulin being able to unlock the door, it's almost like there's bubble gum in the door, in the lock. And so the insulin cannot actually unlock the door that allows sugar to get into the cell. Now, the reason why that happens, there's a lot of theory that goes around as to why that may happen, but the problem here is that we have a lot of sugar now that starts to build up inside the bloodstream. So the insulin is there, but it's just not working to unlock that cell. And so you get a buildup of insulin and you get a buildup of sugar in the bloodstream. Interestingly, what insulin is, it's a growth hormone. It causes you to store fat, and it also causes a growth-like effect on the ovaries. Now, a lot of the time women will say, oh, I've been diagnosed with PCOS. We'll ask how, and they'll say, I've got cysts on my ovaries. Now, I'm sure a lot of you, maybe you know somebody, or perhaps you yourself have been told that you have cysts on your ovaries. But interestingly, polycystic ovarian syndrome can actually be diagnosed in people who do not have multiple cysts on their ovaries. So there are some people who have PCOS that actually, when we do an ultrasound, you don't find any of those cysts on the ovaries. So this is a unique situation, and this is why it's a little bit difficult to make this diagnosis in some people. So polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS, even though it is something that you may think is purely related to your fertility, these women are particularly at risk for things like diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. And so you can appreciate that this is a really, really important thing that we need to start paying more attention to. There are women who are perhaps walking around not knowing that they have this diagnosis, and perhaps feeling like, you know, it's normal for the period to be abnormal, for the period to come and go. Perhaps it's normal for them to have the symptoms that they're experiencing. But I just want to remind everybody that it's important to pay attention to the cues that your body is sending you. If you're experiencing any of these symptoms, please go and get yourself checked out. Okay, so the tests that can confirm polycystic ovarian syndrome include blood tests as well as ultrasound. Okay, so like I said earlier, ultrasound doesn't necessarily confirm the diagnosis, because there are some women who don't have cysts on the ovaries and they still have PCOS. Okay, so sometimes you can pick it up on ultrasound, other times not. So the blood tests that we would do would include the hormone profile. In particular, in polycystic ovarian syndrome, what we're looking at is how high are the androgens. Okay, now when I say androgens, those are the male hormones. As I said, as women, we are supposed to have some kind of male hormones in our systems. However, we're not supposed to have high levels of male hormones, right? So in particular, we're looking for things, some androgens like testosterone, even DHEA levels. So your doctor will be able to determine, are your testosterone or androgen levels excessively high for what we would expect in a woman? Okay, the other thing that we can check for, depending on the time in the cycle, is there's two other important hormones called LH and FSH. So those are luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And in polycystic ovarian syndrome, the FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, is going to be low, and the luteinizing hormone, the LH, is going to be very high. So your doctor will be able to interpret your hormone profile just to make sure that you are not having androgen excess. The second blood test that we would do to diagnose PCOS is to check your insulin levels. The other important thing to test is your thyroid hormone, because some of these symptoms that I've described actually also happen in people with an underfunctioning thyroid. So it would be important to check and make sure that the thyroid hormone levels are not abnormal as well, just to make sure that we're not missing another condition that is not PCOS. Thank you so much for joining me today. Please send me all your questions. I'd be happy to answer anything that you want to ask me. And thank you so much once again for joining me. Ciao!